The entrance was buried under 6 feet of snow, but Bjorn Halvorsen didn't panic. While men in traditional cabins 20 miles away suffocated behind frozen doors they could never open, he simply crawled into his tunnel and began digging toward daylight. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if you love stories of frontier ingenuity that saved lives, hit subscribe because tomorrow's story might be even more unbelievable than this one. The snow had stopped falling 2 hours before dawn, but Bjorn Halvorsen couldn't sleep. He sat in the darkness of the cabin he had shared with Robert Nielsen for 3 winters, listening to silence that felt wrong. Robert had left the previous afternoon to check their northern trap line, a routine trip that should have taken 4 hours. He had been gone for 16. When gray light finally broke through the single window, Bjorn pulled on his fur coat and stepped outside. The spring blizzard had deposited nearly 3 feet of fresh snow across the Montana Valley they called home. The temperature had dropped brutally after the storm passed, and the morning air burned his lungs with each breath. He followed the direction Robert would have taken, moving through snow that came to his knees in the shallow places and his waist where drifts had formed. He found Robert a quarter-mile from the cabin, 15 feet from their front door. His partner lay face down in the snow, one hand extended toward the structure they had built together in the autumn of 1873. Bjorn knelt beside the body, already knowing what had happened, but needing to see the evidence. Robert's face was blue-gray, his beard crusted with ice, his eyes frozen open. There were no wounds, no signs of animal attack, no indication of anything except cold and failed breath. Bjorn looked back at the cabin and understood immediately. Smoke had stopped rising from the chimney sometime during the night. The door, a simple construction of pine planks hung on leather hinges, hung slightly open now, but ice had formed along its edges where moisture from inside had frozen solid during the coldest hours. He walked to the structure and examined what had killed his partner. The door frame was thick with ice. The leather hinges had contracted and frozen in the extreme cold. When Bjorn pushed on the door from outside, it moved only slightly, the ice creating resistance that would have been impossible to overcome from inside. He stepped through the entry and immediately smelled smoke residue that had filled the interior. The fireplace showed evidence of a fire smothered by poor draft. The chimney had become blocked during the storm. Robert had faced a lethal situation, smoke filling the cabin from a blocked chimney, a door sealed shut by ice. He had chosen to escape, succeeding in breaking through the frozen door, but the effort had cost him precious minutes and precious warmth. Disoriented by smoke, exhausted by the struggle, he had made it only 15 feet before his body gave out. Bjorn spent that day digging through frozen earth to create a grave on the hillside. He buried Robert as the sun set, marking the spot with stones. That night, alone in the cabin, Bjorn sat by a carefully managed fire and stared at the door. The feature meant to protect them had killed his partner as surely as any bear. If it had killed Robert, it could kill anyone. Bjorn knew he would never again sleep behind a door in wilderness country. He would find another way. Bjorn finished the spring trapping season alone, working the lines he and Robert had established over 3 years of partnership. The work was mechanical, requiring little thought, which left his mind free to circle endlessly around the problem of the door. Every evening he returned to the cabin and studied the structure with new eyes, seeing weaknesses he had never noticed before. The leather hinges that had frozen solid were an obvious failure. Point. The simple wooden latch offered no security against ice formation. The door itself, constructed from planks, held together with cross pieces, had warped slightly over 3 winters, creating gaps that let in wind and moisture. But the problem extended beyond their specific cabin. As Bjorn moved through the surrounding territory over the following weeks, he began visiting other trappers' camps and examining their construction methods. Most mountain men built using nearly identical techniques because those techniques had been passed down through informal mentorship and practical experience. Logs notched at corners and stacked to form walls. A single door on leather or simple iron hinges. One small window covered with oiled paper or rawhide. a roof of poles, and bark. The structures could be completed in 4 or 5 days, with 2 men working steadily. Bjorn found 3 abandoned cabins within a 20-mile radius of his camp. 2 had doors torn completely off, the leather hinges rotted or ripped apart. 1 showed evidence of bear damage, where the animal had exploited the natural weakness of the door frame, tearing away the jamb to gain entry. The 3rd cabin had a collapsed roof, the weight of accumulated snow having exceeded what the simple pole structure could support. He talked to every trapper he encountered during May and June of 1876. The conversations followed similar patterns. Everyone had stories of doors that froze shut during cold snaps. Several men described near-death experiences remarkably similar to what had killed Robert. Ezra Thornton had survived a night trapped in his cabin when his door froze solid, saving himself only by cutting through the rawhide-covered window and crawling out into a blizzard. Nathaniel Pierce had lost 3 toes to frostbite after spending 2 hours attempting to force open a frozen door before finally breaking through. Silas Crawford dismissed such concerns entirely, insisting that a man tough enough for mountain life should be tough enough to handle a stubborn door. The pattern became undeniable. Doors were the most vulnerable point in any cabin structure. They failed in cold when ice sealed them shut. They failed in heat when leather dried and cracked. They failed under force when bears or hostile raiders targeted the obvious entry point. They failed during heavy snow when drifts buried them completely, making exit impossible even if the door itself remained functional. Every trapper accepted these risks as inevitable, part of the cost of wilderness living. Bjorn could not accept that inevitability. Robert's death had shown him that acceptance meant eventual death for anyone who spent enough winters behind a door. There had to be another approach, some method of shelter that eliminated the door entirely while still providing protection from elements and predators. The answer existed somewhere. He simply had to find it. Bjorn sold his furs in early July and returned to the mountains by late month with a specific purpose. He was no longer trapping for profit, but studying for survival. He spent the first week of August observing animal dens throughout the valley, paying attention to creatures he had previously considered merely targets for pelts or threats to his supplies. He found a badger den on a south-facing slope and spent an entire afternoon watching the entrance. The opening was small, barely large enough for the animal to pass through, and it led into the hillside at a downward angle. There was no door, no vertical barrier that could freeze or jam. The badger entered and exited by simply crawling through a tunnel it had excavated into the earth. Bjorn examined the entrance closely after the animal left to hunt. The tunnel descended approximately 2 feet before turning horizontally into the hill. Dirt from the excavation was piled to one side, and the entrance showed no signs of collapse despite heavy rains that had fallen the previous week. He found similar patterns in fox dens, marmot burrows, and even abandoned bear hibernation sites. None of these animals built doors. They dug into earth, creating tunnels that led to larger chambers where they slept, raised young, or waited out winter. The entrances could be temporarily blocked by snow, but the animals simply dug through from inside, pushing loose snow out of the way. There was nothing to freeze shut, nothing to jam, nothing to tear off hinges. Bjorn began to remember things from his childhood in Norway that he had not thought about in 20 years. His family's root cellar had been built partially underground, dug into a hillside behind their farmhouse. The entrance had been a simple opening with a wooden cover, but the structure itself was earth-banked on 3 sides. Inside, the temperature remained stable year-round. Potatoes, carrots, and preserved foods stored there never froze in winter and stayed cool in summer. The earth itself acted as insulation, moderating temperature extremes. He recalled a neighbor who had built a smokehouse using similar principles, setting it into a slope so that only the front face was exposed to weather. That structure had lasted decades, while conventional buildings around it required constant repair. The principle was simple but profound. Earth provided insulation, stability, and protection that wooden walls could never match. The more Bjorn thought about it, the more obvious the solution became. He had been thinking about shelter incorrectly his entire life. Traditional cabins were built upward, creating tall walls and peaked roofs that stood exposed to wind, snow, and temperature extremes. Every element fought against the structure. Wind pushed against walls, snow accumulated on roofs, rain found gaps in chinking, cold penetrated wooden barriers. But what if shelter was built into the earth instead of on top of it? What if a man lived like a badger, entering through a tunnel into a chamber protected by hillside and soil? There would be no door to freeze, no roof to collapse under snow, no walls exposed to wind. The earth itself would become the protection. Bjorn made his decision in mid-August. His next shelter would not be a cabin, it would be a tunnel. Bjorn selected his site in late August of 1876, choosing a hillside 3 miles from where he had buried Robert. The location offered southern exposure for maximum sunlight during winter months, good drainage to prevent water accumulation, and a slope gentle enough to dig into but steep enough to provide solid earth coverage. The hill rose approximately 30 feet above the surrounding valley floor, composed of dense clay soil mixed with rocks and tree roots. Other trappers noticed his choice immediately. Silas Crawford rode past on his way to check beaver ponds and stopped to watch Bjorn marking out dimensions with stakes and cord. "You're building on a slope?" Silas asked, his tone suggesting he had discovered evidence of insanity. "Water will flood you out, come spring melt." Bjorn explained his drainage plan, how the entrance would face downhill and water would naturally run away from the structure. Silas shook his head and rode away, unconvinced. 2 days later, Ezra Thornton arrived with similar concerns. "Digging into a hill makes no sense. You'll hit rock before you get 3 feet in." Bjorn had already tested the soil composition. He had dug test holes at various points along the hillside, examining what lay beneath the surface. The earth was workable, dense enough to hold its shape, but not so rocky that excavation would be impossible. He showed Ezra his test pits, explained his reasoning, and received only skepticism in return. By early September, Bjorn began serious excavation. He started at a point 20 feet up the hillside and began digging horizontally into the slope. His tools were simple: a shovel, a pickaxe, and leather sacks for hauling dirt. The work was brutally hard. Each shovelful of earth had to be loosened with the pick, loaded into a sack, carried outside, and dumped. Progress was measured in inches per day. The tunnel advanced slowly into the hillside. Bjorn maintained dimensions of approximately 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, large enough to crawl through comfortably, but small enough that the earth ceiling would support itself without immediate reinforcement. As he dug deeper, he piled the excavated soil to the sides of the entrance, creating berms that would later serve as additional wind protection. After 10 feet of horizontal tunnel, Bjorn began excavating the main chamber. This required different techniques. He had to remove significantly more earth while ensuring the ceiling remained stable. He worked carefully, leaving support pillars of undisturbed earth at intervals, planning to replace them later with wooden posts. The chamber gradually took shape, roughly 12 feet wide, 14 feet deep, and 7 feet high at the center. The excavation phase took 5 weeks. By early October, Bjorn had removed approximately 400 cubic feet of earth from the hillside. His hands were calloused and bleeding. His back ached constantly. Neighbors continued to mock his efforts. Nathaniel Pierce called it Halverson's grave and predicted Bjorn would bury himself alive. But the basic excavation was complete. Now came the engineering that would transform a hole in the ground into a shelter that could withstand anything the mountains offered. Bjorn spent the first week of October selecting and cutting logs. Unlike traditional cabin construction, where any reasonably straight tree would suffice, he needed specific dimensions and characteristics. He wanted logs approximately 10 inches in diameter, as uniform as possible along their length, from trees that had grown straight without excessive branches. He rejected dozens of candidates before finding suitable timber. Each log required hours of work. After felling the tree, he stripped the bark completely using a draw knife, then shaped the log to remove irregularities. The process was tedious, but Bjorn understood that uniform logs would stack more tightly and create stronger structures. He cut each log to 8-foot lengths for the tunnel lining and 12-foot lengths for the main chamber ceiling. The tunnel construction began with the ceiling. Bjorn positioned logs horizontally across the top of his excavated passage, laying them perpendicular to the tunnel's length. Each log rested on the earthen walls he had left during excavation, creating a natural support system. The logs touched each other along their length, forming a continuous ceiling with minimal gaps. He fitted them carefully, using wooden wedges to eliminate spaces where settling might occur. For the tunnel walls, he stacked logs horizontally along each side, creating sidewalls that rose from floor to ceiling. These logs interlocked with the ceiling logs at the top, forming a rigid structure. The weight of earth he would pile on top would compress everything together. But first, he needed to address the entrance. At the tunnel opening, Bjorn installed 2 vertical support posts. He sank these posts 3 feet into the ground and extended them 7 feet upward to meet the first ceiling log. Each post was 14 inches in diameter, massive compared to the tunnel logs. Their purpose was to transfer the weight of the entire earth-covered ceiling down into the ground, preventing collapse at the most vulnerable point where tunnel met open air. He mortised the ceiling logs into these vertical posts, cutting rectangular notches so the horizontal and vertical timbers locked together. The joint was crude by carpenter standards, but effective for its purpose. Force applied to the ceiling would be transmitted through the posts into bedrock below, rather than creating lateral pressure that might collapse the entrance. The main chamber required different engineering. Bjorn built a framework of ridge poles spanning the width of the excavated space, resting on the earthen walls. He spaced these poles 18 inches apart, closer than necessary for a conventional roof, because the weight they would bear was substantially greater. Across these ridge poles, he laid smaller logs side by side, creating a complete ceiling coverage. Between each log in both tunnel and chamber, Bjorn packed a mixture he had developed through experimentation. He combined clay dug from a stream bed with horsehair obtained by trading with a passing freight wagon and pine resin he had boiled down from collected sap. The mixture had adhesive properties when warm and hardened to a waterproof seal when cool. He worked it into every gap, creating barriers against water infiltration and cold air penetration. By late October, the log work was complete. Now came the critical phase, covering everything with earth. Bjorn began the earthwork in early November, just as the first serious cold settled into the valley. He shoveled dirt onto the log ceiling of his tunnel and main chamber, building up layers gradually to avoid crushing the structure with sudden weight. The soil came from the massive pile he had created during excavation, supplemented by additional earth he dug from the hillside above his shelter. He worked methodically, adding 6 inches of coverage, waiting a day to ensure nothing shifted, then adding another 6 inches. Silas Crawford visited during the second week of November and stood watching Bjorn pile earth onto what appeared to be a completely buried structure. "You've lost your mind, Halverson," Silas said, shaking his head slowly. "You're building a badger hole, a grave for a man still breathing." Bjorn continued working without responding. He had learned that explanations were wasted on men determined to mock what they did not understand. The earth coverage eventually reached 3 feet thick over the main chamber and 2 feet over the tunnel. He shaped the surface to shed water away from the entrance, creating a dome that would prevent pooling during rain or snowmelt. Ezra Thornton arrived a few days later with Nathaniel Pierce. They sat on their horses and observed Bjorn installing a sleeping platform inside the main chamber, a raised wooden structure that would keep him 2 feet above the tunnel floor. "Real men build cabins that stand tall," Ezra called out. "Something you can see from a distance, something that shows you're not afraid of the wilderness." Nathaniel was more direct in his assessment. "First, heavy rain will flood that hole and drown you like a rat in a barrel. You're too stubborn to see sense, but at least you'll die alone and won't take anyone with you." The criticism continued through November as Bjorn completed the interior work. He built a small fireplace in one corner of the main chamber using flat stones he collected from the creek bed. The chimney was narrow, barely 6 inches in diameter, and extended upward through the earth-covered ceiling to exit 15 feet from the main entrance. He disguised the chimney outlet with a pile of dead branches that allowed smoke to escape while making the opening invisible from any distance. He constructed storage shelves along the earthen walls, braced with wooden supports driven into the packed soil. A small table built with the same careful joinery he had used throughout the project. Hooks mounted to ceiling beams for hanging tools and supplies. Every element was overbuilt by frontier standards, engineered to last decades rather than seasons. By late November, the shelter was functionally complete. The logs had weathered to a gray-brown that blended with the hillside. Moss had begun growing on the earth-covered roof, fed by moisture and helped along by fragments Bjorn had transplanted from the forest floor. From 50 yards away, the structure was nearly invisible, appearing as nothing more than a natural slope with a small, dark opening near ground level. The community had a name for it now, Halverson's Burrow. They said it with derision, but Bjorn accepted the name without complaint. Winter was coming, and words would matter less than engineering. The first snow fell on December 3, 1876. Bjorn woke in his earth lodge to complete silence, a stark contrast to the wind howl and timber creaking he had experienced in traditional cabins. He crawled through his tunnel to the entrance and found 8 inches of fresh snow had accumulated overnight, partially blocking the opening. He pushed through easily, the loose snow offering no resistance, and emerged into a white landscape transformed by the storm. The temperature had dropped to near zero, but inside his shelter, the air remained comfortable enough that his small fire had burned down to coals without making the space cold. Bjorn rebuilt the fire and prepared coffee, noting that he was using far less firewood than he had burned in previous winters. The earth insulation was performing exactly as he had calculated. Over the following weeks, a pattern established itself. Snow fell regularly, sometimes accumulating several feet around the entrance. Each morning, Bjorn would crawl to the opening and push through whatever snow had drifted against it during the night. The process took minutes, not the hours that clearing a traditional door required. He could dig from inside the tunnel, using it as a workspace, pushing excavated snow behind him into the entrance area where he could later haul it outside. The real test came during a 3-day storm in late December. Wind drove snow horizontally across the valley, creating drifts that buried everything at ground level. Bjorn's entrance completely disappeared under a drift that measured nearly 5 feet deep at its peak. He waited until the storm ended, then began excavating from inside his tunnel. The work was straightforward. He used a wooden paddle to push snow backward through the tunnel into the main chamber, where he packed it against one wall. Once he had created a path roughly 3 feet long, he switched to simply compressing the snow to the sides of the tunnel rather than removing it entirely. Within 30 minutes of starting, he had opened a passage to the surface. He emerged into brilliant sunshine reflecting off pristine snow, checked his trap lines within a 2-mile radius, and returned to his shelter by early afternoon. He heard reports from other trappers throughout the winter. Ezra Thornton had burned through his entire woodpile by mid-January and was cutting fresh timber in brutal cold because his drafty cabin consumed fuel at an unsustainable rate. Nathaniel Pierce had spent 6 hours chopping ice from his door during a cold snap, finally resorting to building a fire against the doorframe to melt the ice seal. Silas Crawford had given up on his door entirely after it warped and refused to close properly, hanging a heavy blanket across the opening instead. Bjorn's tunnel shelter required none of these desperate measures. The temperature inside remained stable regardless of conditions outside. His firewood supply diminished slowly. The entrance, despite being buried repeatedly, never took more than an hour to clear in the worst conditions. By February, Bjorn knew his design worked, but the ultimate test was still coming. The sky on January 27, 1877, had a quality Bjorn recognized from years of reading mountain weather. The air was utterly still. The temperature had risen slightly despite the season, and the light had taken on a flat, gray character that signaled major precipitation. He spent that afternoon bringing in extra firewood, filling his water containers from the creek, and checking his food supplies. Everything suggested a significant storm was approaching. Snow began falling just after dark. By midnight, it was coming down so heavily that Bjorn could not see 10 feet beyond his entrance when he crawled out to check conditions. The wind had picked up, driving snow horizontally across the landscape. He retreated into his tunnel, secured the leather cover he had fashioned for the entrance as an inner barrier against wind-blown snow, and settled in to wait. The blizzard continued without pause through the entire next day. Bjorn maintained a small fire for warmth and cooking, burning far less wood than would have been necessary in an exposed cabin. The chimney draft worked perfectly, pulling smoke upward and out through the concealed opening despite the wind howling across the surface above him. Inside the earth lodge, he could hear the storm only as a distant, muffled roar, like standing inside a cave while a river raged outside. By the second day, the entrance tunnel had filled completely with wind-driven snow. Bjorn began the excavation process methodically. He worked from inside the main chamber, crawling into the tunnel and using a wooden paddle to push snow backward into the living space. He packed it against the walls in areas he did not need for movement. The work was physically demanding, but not dangerous. He could rest whenever necessary, warm himself by the fire, then return to digging. After 2 hours of work, he broke through to the surface. The opening he created was immediately filled by blowing snow, but he could see daylight through the white chaos. He pushed through, emerging into a world transformed. Drifts had created a landscape of white hills and valleys where flat ground had existed before. The storm showed no signs of diminishing. Bjorn checked the area immediately around his shelter, noted that several feet of snow now covered the roof, adding insulation rather than creating problems, then retreated back inside. He repeated this process each day. The entrance would fill with snow overnight or during heavy wind periods. He would excavate from inside, create an opening, check conditions, and return. The tunnel system functioned exactly as designed, giving him the ability to maintain access to the outside world regardless of accumulation levels. On the fourth day, January 31st, the snow finally stopped. The wind continued for another 12 hours, redistributing what had fallen, then it too died away. Bjorn emerged into absolute stillness and sunshine, reflecting off snow that measured between 6 and 8 feet deep in the drifts. His tunnel entrance was completely buried, invisible beneath the white surface, but he had dug through it in less than an hour. The impossible had become routine. Bjorn spent the morning of February 1st checking his immediate area, but by afternoon he decided to visit the nearest trappers to assess how they had weathered the storm. Silas Crawford's cabin was closest, approximately 4 miles east across the valley. The journey that normally took an hour required 3 in the deep snow. Bjorn used snowshoes he had constructed from bent willow and rawhide, but even with them, movement was exhausting. He found Silas 30 yards from his cabin, frozen in the snow. The body was partially buried, one arm extended toward the structure. Bjorn approached and understood what had happened. Silas had attempted to exit his cabin after the door became buried or frozen shut. He had somehow broken through or dug out, but the effort had exhausted him. Disoriented by the whiteout conditions that had existed during the height of the storm, he had moved in the wrong direction. Instead of heading toward the nearest shelter or timber, he had wandered into open ground. His body showed he had fallen and never risen. Bjorn examined the cabin itself. Snow had drifted against the south wall where the door was located, creating a mass nearly 8 feet high. The door was visible only as a slight depression in the drift. From inside, Silas would have faced an impossible situation. He could not open the door against the weight of snow pressed against it. His only option had been to dig, but digging through 8 feet of wind-packed snow from inside a cabin, working through a doorway, would require hours of brutal labor. Silas had apparently succeeded, but the victory had killed him. Bjorn forced himself to continue checking other locations. He traveled south toward where Isaac Brennan lived with his wife and 2 young children. The journey took 2 more hours through snow that had drifted into massive formations, some reaching 10 feet high, where the wind had sculpted them against terrain features. He found the Brennan cabin from a distance by spotting the collapsed roof. The structure had failed under the weight of accumulated snow, the simple pole and bark roof design unable to support what the storm had deposited. As Bjorn approached, he heard a sound that stopped him. A child crying, faint but unmistakable. He ran the last 100 yards, floundering through deep drifts. The cabin's roof had collapsed inward, but one corner remained partially intact. The family had crowded into this space, huddling together under blankets and what remained of their ceiling. Isaac looked up as Bjorn appeared in the doorway, his face showing relief mixed with desperation. 3 days, Isaac said, his voice barely above a whisper. Roof came down the first night. We've been here since, afraid to move, afraid it would collapse completely. The wife held both children against her. All 4 were shaking with cold, despite the blankets. Their fire had gone out when the roof collapsed, snow having smothered it and made relighting impossible. Bjorn made a decision immediately. My shelter is 4 miles north. Can you walk? Isaac nodded. If it means living. The journey back to Bjorn's shelter took 5 hours. Isaac carried his youngest child. His wife carried the older boy. Bjorn led them through the snow, breaking trail and ensuring they did not become disoriented in the featureless white landscape. When they finally reached the hillside, Isaac stared in confusion at what appeared to be undisturbed terrain. "Where's your cabin?" he asked. Bjorn pointed at a small, dark opening at ground level, barely visible against the snow-covered slope. There. He crawled through the entrance tunnel first, then guided the family in one by one. They emerged into the main chamber and stopped, stunned by what they found. The space was warm, genuinely warm, despite having only a small fire burning in the stone fireplace. The walls were earthen, but dry. The ceiling was logs covered with soil, but solid and stable. Everything about the structure contradicted their understanding of frontier shelter. Isaac's wife began crying softly. Whether from relief or exhaustion or simple warmth, Bjorn could not tell. He fed the family dried meat and hot broth, gave them blankets, and showed them where they could sleep. The main chamber that had seemed adequate for 1 man was cramped with 5 people, but it was survivable. Over the next 3 days, as the family recovered their strength, Isaac studied every detail of the tunnel shelter. He examined the horizontal log construction, the vertical support posts at the entrance, the earth coverage that provided insulation. He watched Bjorn excavate the entrance each morning when new snow had drifted against it, the process taking less than an hour regardless of accumulation. "It's warmer in here than our cabin ever was," Isaac said on the 3rd day. "Even with a fire going constantly, we fought drafts. This place holds heat like a root cellar." Bjorn explained the principles as he understood them. Earth insulation. Minimal opening to reduce heat loss. The tunnel acting as an airlock where cold air settled while warm air remained in the main chamber. The compression structure of the log ceiling supporting earth weight. Isaac listened with the attention of a man whose previous assumptions had nearly killed his family. When the family finally left a week later, heading to a trading post where Isaac had relatives, he stopped at the entrance and looked back at the shelter that had saved them. "I'm building one of these come spring," he said. Exactly like this. Word spread through the scattered trapping community over the following months. Ezra Thornton visited in March, asking detailed questions about construction techniques. By summer of 1877, 3 trappers were excavating hillsides and stacking horizontal logs into tunnel frameworks. They called them earth lodges, or tunnel shelters, and within 5 years, the design had spread throughout the Northern Territories, where winter killed men in conventional cabins. Bjorn continued living in his original shelter for 15 more years. The structure outlasted every traditional cabin in the valley, the earth-integrated design, immune to the rot and settling that destroyed conventional construction. He had solved an impossible problem through observation and engineering, and in doing so, created something that lasted far beyond his own lifetime.